Link TV, connecting you to the world. Link TV is viewer supported. Watch more at linktv.org.
Link TV presents Mosaic World News from the Middle East. Here are today's top stories.
Syrian security crackdown targets artists and intellectuals. Afghan civilian death toll hits record high. And the Yemeni people accuse Saudi Arabia of sowing chaos in their country. Mosaic World News from the Middle East begins now.
Conflicting reports are emerging from Deir az-Zor while protests supporting the regime break out in Damascus.
Agence France Presse quoted a member of the Human Rights Association of Syria, Abdul Karim Rahawi, saying that security forces opened fire on protesters in Deir az-Zor, killing 2 and wounding about 5. Rahawi said that tension dominates the city and people are on a general strike called for by pro-democracy activists through Facebook. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said that according to activists in Homs, 11 citizens were wounded by the gunfire of Syrian security forces in the neighborhoods of Bab Sabai and Duar Fakura. Websites released this video online, which they say is of the general strike that occurred in a number of cities. Meanwhile, the BBC quoted eyewitnesses saying that security forces began wide-scale raids early Thursday morning in the Bab Sabai neighborhood of Homs, and that heavy gunfire was heard across the neighborhood. Residents are working to set up fences and barricades to prevent the security forces from advancing. For its part, Syrian TV said that groups of masked men tried to block the road and threatened citizens with weapons to close their local shops. It also aired these images of funerals for members of the security forces and the army. In addition, the Syrian state media showed protests in Damascus in support of the regime and the reform process.
Conflicting information is emerging regarding the arrest of Syrian actors and intellectuals in the demonstrations in Maidan neighborhood. While reports confirm the arrests, the Syrian authorities have made no official comment about them.
The
report about the arrest of a group of Syrian artists and intellectuals in yesterday's protest in Damascus's Maidan neighborhood remains ambiguous. While the Syrian opposition confirms information, the authorities make no official comment on it. An estimated 2,000 protesters from various Syrian provinces spoke of being subjected to beatings by batons and electric sticks when they demanded freedom and the release of political prisoners. The opposition's pages on social networking sites are filled with comments calling for the release of these artists, including actress Mai Skaf and actor Faris El Helou. It is said that Faris El Helou wrote this comment on his page. These moments are unforgettable, as if I am hearing my voice for the very first time. They bring tears to my eyes. But how is it possible for Helou to use the internet in his prison cell, unless the internet has become accessible in Syrian prisons in the newest round of reforms? Both the opposition and the regime are ignoring this question at the moment. Another prominent face that emerged from the detainees is Khalid Tajia, but he denied that he was arrested in a phone call to Al Arabia's correspondent in Damascus, saying that he did not initially take part in the protests. Some other prominent names include Iya Sharbaji and 2 brothers, Mohammed and Ahmad Malas, whose pictures occupied the opposition's Facebook pages.
News from Syria. Syrian tribes have warned against any visit by the U.S. ambassador to Damascus to the eastern city of Deir al-Zor. The tribes have said in a statement that Robert Ford has plans to visit Deir al-Zor in an effort to ignite strife and divisions among the people. They have warned that the U.S. administration will be responsible for its ambassador's life if he presses ahead with his plan. Last week, Ford visited the central city of Hama. The visit prompted anti-U.S. demonstration in several Syrian cities. Syria accused the U.S. ambassador of meeting with what it called saboteurs. Damascus said it considered Ford's visit as clear proof of Washington's attempts to increase tensions to damage Syria's security and stability.
Well, now to Bahrain, where a political poet has just been released from jail and now has been placed under house arrest by the Manama regime. Ayatollah Khamenei was detained on March 30th for reciting a poem critical of the regime during pro-democracy protests. Now, the Bahraini regime has charged her with incitement and insulting members of the royal family. Last month, she was sentenced to 1 year behind bars. She was finally released on Wednesday and has been told by authorities that she cannot leave her house. Al-Qarmezi says she was made to sign a pledge that she would remain at home, would not protest, and would not speak to the media. However, the young poet says she is not afraid and she will continue to speak out. Well, the Secretary General of the Arab League says he will submit a request for UN recognition of an independent Palestinian state. Nabil al-Arabi says the Arab League would present its bid both to the UN General Assembly and the Security Council. Al-Arabi's comments come after a meeting of the Arab League in Qatar. Now, the Palestinian Authority has long been seeking official UN recognition for Palestine as an independent state, but the plan has been opposed by the U.S., some of its Western allies, and Israel. Well, at least 13 Turkish soldiers have been killed and 7 others injured in an ambush by suspected PKK militants in Turkish southeastern city of Silvan. Now, reports say that 2 of the injured soldiers are in critical condition. This has been the deadliest attack on Turkish troops in more than a year. Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan has held an emergency meeting in the capital Ankara to discuss the situation. Now, earlier on Thursday, suspected PKK militants kidnapped 2 construction workers building a military outpost in the eastern province of Tunceli. We're going to switch over to Istanbul, where Jody Sabral is standing by. Now, Jody, can you explain what exactly has taken place? What has happened?
Well, what we know now is what the Turkish media are reporting, that 13 soldiers have been killed in a roadside ambush in the southeast of the country, and that 7 were also injured in that incident. It's supposed to have taken place in a village called Dolapdere in Diyarbakir province, which is a heavily populated Kurdish area, and the NTV news channel is reporting that 5 PKK members have been killed in clashes today and that operations are still underway. So I don't have much more information than that at the moment, only that I can confirm the Prime Minister has called for an emergency meeting in Ankara with top security officials. Now, this, of course, will be a test for the new Defence Minister who was appointed last week. Operations are continuing in the southeast. Just to point out, it's not unusual to hear of some casualties. In fact, earlier today, as you mentioned, there were some kidnappings by the PKK of some Turkish workers. But it is significant, as this attack is the deadliest attack on Turkish military by the PKK since October 2007. So the government and the military will be taking this extremely seriously.
The United Nations has formally announced South Sudan's assent to the international body. The UN General Assembly approved Africa's youngest country as its 193rd member. South Sudan, with 8 million people, split away from the north on July 9. Its independence came after nearly 98% of its population voted for secession in January. The referendum was held under a peace deal reached in 2005 to end a north-south civil war. Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir has called for positive relations with the newly established Republic of South Sudan.
The Sudanese government and the Armed Justice and Equality Movement in Darfur will sign the peace agreement in Doha in a few moments. It is the final agreement for peace in Darfur. In attendance will be Qatar's emir and a number of African presidents.
The agreement was approved during the Darfur Stakeholders Conference that was held in Doha. Meanwhile, the Justice and Equality Movement announced its rejection to the signing of the agreement.
Our Al Jazeera correspondent, Mohammed El-Kabir Al-Khatoubi, reports from the Doha platform for peace in Darfur.
It required 30 months of direct and indirect negotiations to reach an agreement between the Sudanese government and Darfur's armed movements. The deal was mediated by the Doha Platform for Peace in Darfur. Negotiations were held in the Qatari capital, Sudan, Chad, Libya, Ethiopia, France, and other countries. The agreement was approved last May during the Darfur Stakeholders Conference, which brought together a number of the country's official and popular figures. The conference is described as having raised the demands of the people of Darfur, for which arms were taken up. It encompasses sharing power and resources, reparations, the return of refugees and the displaced, human rights, security measures, justice, and reconciliation. However, only two sides of the Darfur struggle will be signing the agreement, the Sudanese government and the Liberation and Justice Movement. They believe it will bring an end to the cycle of war in Darfur, ongoing since 2003, and its repercussions. The two sides plan on implementing the agreement within 1 month from within the states of Darfur.
This peace process derives its legitimacy from the complete agreement. In addition, it receives its legitimacy from this long process, from which no one was excluded. From the technical aspect, it will remain open to the movements that wish to have peace, God willing. With that, we would have responded to the urgent, popular Darfuri will.
We, the Liberation and Justice Movement, managed to overcome the many disputes with the Sudanese government, with the exception of one fundamental problem, which is naming the members of the executive body. In turn, we expect the mediators to suggest a compromise. Otherwise, all measures were taken to sign this agreement. From our side as well, measures were taken for the refugees and the people of Darfur everywhere.
The largest absentees from the signing of the Darfur Peace Agreement are the Sudan Liberation Movement, the Abdul Wahed al-Nur Wing, and the Justice and Equality Movement, which is present in Doha but believes the agreement does not represent all of the aspirations of the people of Darfur.
We are against the signing of a partial agreement. The choices we present to the mediators and those overseeing the peace process are to either hold a serious dialogue that includes all sides or to continue down that same path. At the end, we will repeat the Abuja experience.
The Doha Platform for Peace in Darfur is close to signing the final agreement for peace in Darfur. However, the question of who will be named as the Secretary or Minister of the soon-to-be-formed executive body is not the only one that remains. There are many unanswered questions related to the other armed movements that will not sign this agreement. Mohammed Al-Kabir Al-Katubi, Al Jazeera, Doha.
ونبقى في الشأن الأفغاني إذ أشار تقرير للأمم المتحدة إلى أن الأشهر الستة الأولى من
A UN report indicated that the first 6 months of 2011 saw the highest civilian death toll since the war on Afghanistan began 10 years ago. The report said that the number of civilians killed in the war rose by 15% compared to last year. The release of this report comes as NATO forces begin to hand over the security missions in some regions to the Afghan forces.
بعض الأقاليم إلى القوات الأفغانية.
It has been 10 years since Operation Enduring Freedom was launched by the US, UK, and Afghan forces with the goal of dismantling al-Qaeda, removing the Taliban from power, and creating a viable democratic society. A decade has passed and the goal has not been completely achieved. On the contrary, what Afghan society is witnessing today is a record-breaking civilian death toll since the war began, according to the United Nations. The UN report showed that the first 6 months of this year witnessed the killing of 1,462 civilians. The Taliban and other armed groups are responsible for killing 80% of these civilians, mostly by using explosive devices and suicide attacks. Meanwhile, the government's loyalist forces are responsible for 14% of these civilian deaths. In this context, NATO's strikes alone caused the deaths of 79 civilians in the first 6 months of the year. Over half of these civilians were killed in airstrikes by Apache helicopters. These figures strongly refute recent statements by Western officials that the security situation in Afghanistan is improving, paving the way for the transfer of security missions in some regions to Afghan security forces within days. However, 10 years after the expensive war hasn't made any military gains, most of the Western countries began to see withdrawal from Afghanistan as an encouraging decision. As for the legacy of 10 years of war, it is the number of civilians killed in it. Karine Tarabai, BBC.
دعا الرئيس الفرنسي نيكولا ساركوزي إلى عقد اجتماع خاص اليوم لمناقشة إجراءات أمنية جديدة تهدف إلى حماية.
French President Nicolas Sarkozy called for convening a special meeting today to discuss new security measures aimed at protecting the French soldiers in Afghanistan. This comes a day after France suffered the largest loss of its soldiers in Afghanistan in one day since 2008. 5 French soldiers were killed yesterday in a suicide bombing in Afghanistan.
إضافة إلى مقتل جندي فرنسي آخر اليوم. كان الرئيس الفرنسي قد أعلن خطته القاضية بسحب 1000 جندي من قوة.
In addition, 2 other French soldiers were killed today. The French president announced his plans to pull out 1,000 French soldiers in Afghanistan by the end of next year, before the complete withdrawal of its 4,000 troops in 2014.
Yemeni Joint Meeting Parties, JMP, denied an article published in the Saudi newspaper Al-Sharq Al-Awsat saying that JMP's forces are fighting Houthis in Al-Jawf province. A JMP leader, Musad Radai, told Al-Alam that Saudi Arabia is behind the escalation in order to sabotage Yemen's popular revolution.
The developments that some countries in the region have been witnessing have aroused controversy among decision-makers in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The protests, which began in countries that had strong ties with the kingdom, such as Tunisia and Egypt, prompted Saudi Arabia to try to prevent these revolutions from causing change in the kingdom. The Saudi rulers are afraid that democratic countries will emerge near its borders. After Hosni Mubarak's regime collapsed, the House of Saud has worked with all its power to exercise its interventionist policies to prevent these disturbances from reaching the Persian Gulf region. Yemen, which has been witnessing waves of protest for 6 months, has turned into a source of concern for the Saudis. Politicians in Riyadh quickly moved to promote an initiative that entails Saleh stepping down a month after the formation of a new government. However, analysts who follow Saudi affairs indicate that there are disputes between the senior princes and Saudi officials over whether Saudi Arabia should take a backseat or intervene even more strongly to prevent democratic changes from happening in Yemen. Indeed, there are now 2 wings of the dispute over the Yemen issue. The first is the Interior Minister, Prince Nayef bin Abdulaziz, who supports Saleh, and the second is the Defense Minister Crown Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz, who sees the tribe sponsored by the kingdom as an alternative to Saleh. With the failure of the Gulf Cooperation Council's proposals and the revolutionaries' persistence, Riyadh found things in Yemen to be getting out of control and heading toward a revolution that does not serve Saudi Arabia's interests. It appears that the Saudi ruler's next move is to stir up a civil and tribal war in Yemen, aiming to shuffle the cards and maintain control of the country's security issue.
There are Gulf members who are keen on keeping this regime and want it to open doors to a new colonization of the country. They are mobilizing these military bases and mechanisms and providing them with enormous support militarily, politically, and financially.
In this context, Yemenis accuse the Saudi regime of sowing chaos by arming militias loyal to Riyadh in Al-Jawf province to attack Houthis in the north. Sporadic clashes have been ongoing for days in Al-Jawf, killing dozens.
What happens in Al-Jawf in the northern regions is the result of Saudi interference and interference from forces backed by Ali Abdullah Saleh.
Saudi Arabia has interfered with its forces directly in the 6th war against the Houthis. It used the most developed weapons and equipment to shell villages in Sada and its neighboring areas. Political observers believe that Riyadh's position remains supportive of Saleh's stay, despite the fact that he is not ruling the regime in person and the country is administering itself without a president.
The contentious boycott bill is creating waves in the international community. The European Union has expressed concern over the possible ramifications of the legislation. A spokesman for EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton said that while the EU recognizes Israel's sovereignty in the legislative process, it remains concerned about the effect that this new bill may have on the freedom of Israeli citizens and organizations to express nonviolent political opinions. The EU said it will continue to discuss the matter with Israeli authorities. Similar comments were echoed by the U.S. State Department. Staying with the fallout from the boycott bill, the Knesset has been recently presented with a controversial list of legislative initiatives which opponents are dubbing anti-democratic. Joining me in the studio to discuss latest developments and their ramifications is Professor Avraham Diskin of the Hebrew University's Department of Political Science. Professor Diskin, thanks so much for coming in. The boycott bill, the proposed NGO inquiry law, and the proposed legislation aimed at curbing the selection process of judges. Are we witnessing a changing trend of legislation?
First of all, I think that we have to judge every law on its own. I know that some people who criticize the present government say, well, all these are anti-democratic, fascist laws, etc. I really don't think that any of these laws is fascist. I do see quite a number of problems in the laws, and they could be controversial. And of course, they do reflect that we have a certain kind of government today. But I don't think that we are really crossing any kind of line, not with the law that was passed yesterday, and not with any of the other laws.
Professor Diskin, are we looking at attempts to politicize the judicial system?
I'll tell you the truth, in the past, when I taught my students, I said the selections of judges in Israel, that's the best really way to select judges, because you have professionals in the committee, 3 Supreme Court judges, 2 lawyers, you have 2 ministers, 2 members of Knesset, 1 from the opposition, etc. But in fact, what happened is that really the Supreme Court judges dictated all the selections of new Supreme Court judges until the last round, really. So it was really the Supreme Court judges electing themselves. Now, coupled with that, we also have a very clear process that the Supreme Court is taking more and more responsibilities, I would say more and more powers to itself on the expense of the executive and the legislative. So all this coupled is, I think, very, very problematic. And because of that, what the bill really suggests, the bill that we don't have yet, we're not talking about the bill of yesterday, but about the bill of tomorrow or something like that. So that bill really says the Knesset will have a veto power, okay? That's it, not more than that. So it's not that the Knesset is going to elect the judges. That's not the case. And by the way, in most countries of the world, the judges are elected by politicians. Israel is quite an exception. So what is going now is really a very small step in, blocking the absolute power that the Supreme Court had until now.
But isn't that a violation in itself of the democracy? If the Knesset has a say in who's going to be a judge, won't that politicize the legal system here as well?
Yeah, well, in that case, I would say that there is no democratic country in the world, because in all countries of the world, the judges are elected by the politicians.
Members of the Lebanese Future Movement said trust between the party and Hezbollah has been deeply shaken. They accused Hezbollah of attending the national dialogue with the goal of submitting the other point of view.
This comes as former Lebanese Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri confirms that Hezbollah's insistence on possessing weapons is the source of conflict in Lebanon.
The Lebanese street seems to be preoccupied with the statement of the Future Movement leader Saad al-Hariri. From Paris, the former prime minister managed to draw a roadmap for the opposition in order to deal with the current issues. The confrontation between the two sides is now out in the open, and the issue is no longer masked by the weapons of Hezbollah, which toppled Hariri's government and replaced it with another. The roadmap requires the International Tribunal's work to continue by meeting the next step to bring down Najib Mikati's government.
Our opposition party does not take to the street, occupy the center of the city, disrupt public life, surround the government palace, or assault people. Our opposition is democratic, and a democratic opposition has its own means, which we will use and implement. This is not an opposition for the sake of having one. We want to topple the government based on what we believe it will do, which is not beneficial for the country.
To face Hariri's confrontational plan, Hezbollah is leading the new majority in a counter-challenge to preserve the government, at least until the fate of the conflict with the International Tribunal becomes clear. Hezbollah's challenge begins with securing the government's success in its attempt to gain public support and weaken the pretext of the opposition.
Hezbollah at least succeeded in creating a government that it is entrenched behind, or at the very least, a government that supports it and stands by it in the confrontation against the indictment, the pressure the group faces, and the series of other challenges it will be facing in the next phase.
Meanwhile, Mikati's government remains under the microscope of the international community and the internal opposition. The International Tribunal will always be the monitoring center. The opposition, led by Hariri, says there will be no dialogue or compromise with the government. As for the International Tribunal, Hezbollah says it will confront it through this government. These equations are considered to be politically sacred by their owners. However, their interpretation seems to be reliant, first and foremost, on regional challenges. Hassan Hijazi, Nile TV, Beirut.
The views expressed on Mosaic are from contributing broadcasters, not Link TV or its sponsors. The production of Mosaic is made possible by grants from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Firedoll Foundation, and by support of viewers like you. Thank you. Watch Mosaic World News online. Stay up to date with breaking news, read our blog, get transcripts of past shows, and more at linktv.org/mosaic.
This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs which connect you to the world.